The morning of June 6, 1944, brought First Sergeant Leonard Lammel face-to-face with a task that defied logic. At 7:10 a.m., he huddled inside a British landing craft, barely 30 feet from a towering cliff at Pointe du Hoc. Above him, German soldiers hurled grenades from defensive positions that military planners had labeled a suicide mission. Lammel was 24 years old, a college graduate from Tennessee, with precisely 0 days of combat experience. Yet here he was, tasked with scaling a 100-foot vertical cliff face while under direct enemy fire. The strategic importance of this position couldn't be overstated. Intelligence reports indicated 6 French 155mm artillery pieces occupied the clifftop, captured weapons from France's 1940 defeat. These guns possessed a range of 25,000 yards, capable of reaching both Omaha Beach 7 miles east and Utah Beach 4 miles west. More critically, they could devastate the invasion fleet anchored offshore. A naval intelligence officer had been brutally honest with Lieutenant Colonel James Rudder, the assault commander. 3 old women with brooms could defend that cliff successfully. Rudder's response was simple and direct. "My men will do it." The 2nd Ranger Battalion had been activated just over a year earlier at Camp Forest, Tennessee. Major James Rudder assumed command in June 1943, a 34-year-old Texas A&M graduate who'd spent his pre-war years coaching high school football in Eden, Texas. He'd never commanded troops in combat. The training regimen throughout that summer proved absolutely brutal. From 500 volunteers, fewer than 300 completed the program. Men quit. Men suffered injuries. Men were returned to their original units. Those who remained represented the finest physical specimens the Army could produce. Soldiers capable of marching 30 miles with full equipment, scaling vertical surfaces, and engaging in hand-to-hand combat. But they remained completely untested in actual warfare. September 1943 brought the battalion to Fort Pierce, Florida, for amphibious training. The Rangers learned to exit small boats in heavy surf, to advance under fire, to respect the ocean's lethal potential. By November, they'd shipped to England, still without any combat experience. British commandos, who'd been conducting raids on French coastal positions since 1940, became their instructors. These veterans understood cliff assaults, German defenses, and the countless ways men died attempting such operations. At Dorset and the Isle of Wight, they trained Rudder's men using rocket-fired grappling hooks and rope ladders, equipment never before tested for vertical cliff assault under hostile fire. Each Ranger would carry an M1 Garand rifle weighing 9.5 pounds. Standard loadout included 2 grenades, 1 canteen, and a deer ration chocolate bar. The first wave would go up without heavy weapons, no mortars, no machine guns, no bazookas. Just rifles and the men carrying them. Pointe du Hoc rose 100 feet above the English Channel. At its base lay a narrow beach that disappeared completely at high tide. German defenders occupied concrete bunkers and fighting positions along the cliff edge, equipped with rifles, machine guns, mortars, and grenades. Their orders were explicit: defend to the last man. Allied reconnaissance aircraft had photographed the position weekly since January 1944, flying at high altitude to capture detailed images of German fortifications. The photographs clearly showed 6 massive artillery pieces in open concrete gun pits. French GPF 155mm cannon captured in 1940. Each gun weighed over 10,000 pounds and could fire a 95-pound shell more than 11 miles. The Germans were constructing concrete casemates to protect these weapons from air attack, but construction remained incomplete by D-Day. General Dwight Eisenhower studied these intelligence photographs carefully. He called Pointe du Hoc the most dangerous German battery in France. General Omar Bradley concurred, later describing it as the most difficult mission he'd ever assigned to any unit under his command. On the night of June 5th, Companies D, E, and F of the 2nd Ranger Battalion boarded transport ships in the English Channel. 225 Rangers would assault Pointe du Hoc. The invasion had been postponed 24 hours due to weather conditions, and the sea remained rough on June 6th. Waves ran 6 feet high. Wind gusted at 15 miles per hour. These conditions would complicate reaching shore. The ropes would be soaked from sea spray. Wet ropes weighed considerably more than dry ones and wouldn't fly as far when rocket launched. Rudder examined the weather conditions and made no modifications to the plan. At 4:45 a.m. on June 6th, the Rangers loaded into 9 British landing craft assault vessels. Each craft measured 36 feet long, constructed of wood and steel, designed to carry 22 men. These boats were built for beach landings, not cliff assaults, but they were the only available option. The craft departed their transport ship at 5 a.m. The run to Pointe du Hoc would require 90 minutes. H-hour was set for 6:30 a.m. The Rangers would land simultaneously with the first waves hitting Omaha Beach. Naval gunfire would provide support. The battleship USS Texas would fire its 14-inch guns at Pointe du Hoc. The destroyer USS Satterley would add its 5-inch guns. The British destroyer HMS Talabot would contribute additional fire support. The plan called for naval bombardment from 5:50 a.m. until 6:25 a.m., then a 5-minute ceasefire before the Rangers landed, allowing smoke to clear so they could see the cliff face clearly. The operation demanded precise timing and navigation. At 6 a.m., Lammel realized something had gone seriously wrong. He was aboard LCA 668, one of 9 landing craft carrying Rangers toward their objective. He studied the cliffs ahead. They didn't match the photographs he'd memorized over 3 weeks of preparation. The silhouette was incorrect. The gun positions weren't visible where they should be. Lammel shouted to the British coxswain, steering the craft over the engine noise. They were approaching the wrong cliff. The coxswain checked his compass and map. He'd been steering toward Pointe de la Percy, 3 miles east of Pointe du Hoc. The entire 9-craft flotilla was off course. This navigation error would cost them 40 minutes. Rudder, in the command craft, spotted the error simultaneously. He immediately ordered all craft to turn west. The landing craft turned and began running parallel to the coastline. They needed to travel 3 miles west to reach Pointe du Hoc, but the tidal current was running east at 3 knots, pushing directly against them. Speed dropped from 6 knots to 4. They were making barely 1 knot of actual progress toward their target. The Rangers were now 40 minutes behind schedule. The naval bombardment ended at 6:25 a.m. as planned. The big guns fell silent. Smoke drifted across Pointe du Hoc. Germans who'd been sheltering in bunkers during the bombardment emerged and returned to their fighting positions along the cliff edge. They were ready and waiting when the Rangers finally arrived. At 7:10 a.m., the landing craft approached Pointe du Hoc 40 minutes late. The element of surprise had been completely lost. German machine guns opened fire from the clifftop. Tracer rounds arced downward toward the landing craft. Lammel's craft, LCA 668, grounded 20 feet from shore in water deeper than expected. The ramp dropped into chest-deep water. Lammel grabbed a box of ropes in one hand and a rocket launcher in the other, then stepped off the ramp into the frigid water. A German machine gun was firing from directly overhead. Bullets kicked up spray around the landing craft. One round hit Lammel in the right side. The impact spun him around. The bullet passed through flesh without striking bone or organs, burning like fire. Lammel kept moving, pushing through the water toward shore. Other Rangers followed. Some went under and didn't resurface. Their equipment pulled them down. The box of ropes weighed 20 pounds. The rocket launcher weighed 15. The Garand rifle weighed 9.5 pounds. Ammunition added another 10 pounds. Men were carrying 60 to 80 pounds of equipment in chest-deep water while under direct fire. Lammel reached the narrow beach and dropped his load, pressing himself against the cliff base. The overhang provided some protection from grenades being thrown from above. Behind him, other Rangers struggled through the water. Rudder's craft, LCA 888, touched down at 7:12 a.m. Rudder stepped into the water and waded ashore, immediately beginning to direct the assault. His voice carried over the chaos of gunfire and explosions. He pointed to positions along the cliff base and ordered rocket teams to set up their launchers. The rocket teams assembled quickly. The rockets were 4 feet long, mounted on tube launchers. Each rocket had a grappling hook attached to a 150-foot rope, longer than needed for a 100-foot cliff to account for angle of fire and provide rope to spare if some failed. The rocket teams aimed their launchers toward the cliff top and fired at 7:14 a.m. The rockets launched with a distinctive whoosh, leaving smoke trails marking their paths. Some ropes reached the cliff top, and the grappling hooks caught on rocks and concrete. Some fell short. The ropes were waterlogged from sea spray during the 90-minute approach, making them heavier than in training and unable to fly as far. The rocket teams reloaded and fired again. More ropes reached the top. German soldiers appeared at the cliff edge, saw the ropes, and began cutting them with knives and bayonets. Some ropes fell back down the cliff face. Rangers started climbing immediately, before the Germans could cut all the ropes. Waiting would mean no ropes left to climb. British landing craft carrying extension ladders arrived at 7:16 a.m. The ladders were borrowed from the London Fire Brigade, 100-foot extension ladders designed for fighting fires in tall buildings. The Rangers had mounted them on WW amphibious trucks. 3 Duckas made it to shore. One had capsized in the rough seas and sank with its crew. The Duckas drove onto the beach. The crews extended the ladders and propped them against the cliff face. Rangers began climbing while Germans threw stick grenades from above. One grenade landed on a ladder 40 feet up. The explosion killed 2 Rangers and knocked the ladder sideways. Other Rangers kept climbing. Lammel climbed a rope on the left side of the beach. The wound in his side burned with every movement. He ignored it. He pulled himself up hand over hand. His boots scraped against the wet chalk cliff face, searching for footholds that didn't exist. The cliff was nearly vertical. All his weight hung from his arms. The rope swayed in the wind. Machine gun fire snapped past his head. Bullets kicked up chalk dust from a cliff face. At 70 feet up, a German soldier appeared at the cliff edge directly above him. The soldier held a stick grenade. He pulled the cord to arm it and threw. Lammel saw the grenade tumbling toward him. He couldn't dodge. He couldn't let go. He pressed his body against the cliff and turned his head. The grenade exploded 15 feet to his left. Shrapnel hit the cliff face. Rock fragments peppered his left arm, but none hit him directly. His ears rang from the explosion. He resumed climbing. At 90 feet up, his right hand reached the top of the cliff. He grabbed a rock and pulled. His left hand came up. He found a handhold. He pulled himself over the edge and rolled onto flat ground. He lay on his back for 3 seconds, catching his breath. Then he unslung his Thompson submachine gun and looked around. He was among the first Rangers from D Company to reach the cliff top. Around him, other Rangers were pulling themselves up ropes and ladders. Some were shot as they came over the edge and fell back down. Others made it up and immediately moved inland. The cliff top was complete chaos. It looked nothing like the intelligence photographs. Weeks of Allied bombing had transformed the area into a moonscape. Bomb craters 30 feet wide and 15 feet deep covered the ground. Some craters overlapped. The ground was churned earth and broken concrete. Landmarks were gone. The carefully memorized maps were useless. Everything looked identical, just craters and rubble. German defenders were falling back, but still fighting. Snipers fired from shell holes. Machine guns fired from bunkers 200 yards inland. The Rangers couldn't advance in formation. They formed small groups of 3 to 5 men and moved from crater to crater in short rushes. Lammel led his squad toward the western gun positions. D Company's objective was to capture gun positions 4, 5, and 6. They ran in short bursts, diving into craters for cover, firing at any movement. German soldiers returned fire. Rangers fell. Lammel's squad reached the first gun pit at approximately 7:30 a.m. The gun pit was a circular concrete structure 20 feet in diameter, with walls 6 feet thick, pockmarked from bomb fragments. The pit was open to the sky. Lammel entered through a gap blown in the wall. The pit was empty. No gun, no crew, no ammunition, no shell casings, just a wooden pole, standing upright in the center. The pole was camouflaged with netting and paint to resemble a gun barrel from the air. A decoy. Allied reconnaissance aircraft flying at 20,000 feet had photographed this pole thinking it was a 155 millimeters gun. Lammel moved to the second gun pit 50 yards away. He entered carefully, expecting Germans. The pit was empty. Another wooden pole. Another decoy. He felt sick. The mission was to destroy the guns. If there were no guns at Pointe du Hoc, where were they? He moved to the third gun pit. Empty. Another wooden pole. All 3 gun pits on the western side were empty. The guns had been moved. Lammel gathered his squad, now numbering 12 men. The rest of D Company was scattered across the clifftop, engaged with Germans in bunkers and craters. Lammel made a decision. The primary mission was destroying the guns. The guns weren't on the clifftop. They had to be somewhere nearby. The Germans wouldn't have moved them far. Each gun weighed over 10,000 pounds, requiring tractors or horses to move. Lammel told his squad they were moving inland to find the guns. The secondary objective for D Company was reaching the coastal road 400 yards south of the cliff and establishing a roadblock. The road ran from Grand Camp in the west to Vierville in the east. German reinforcements would use that road to move between sectors. If the Rangers could block it, they could prevent German forces from reinforcing the defenders at Omaha Beach. Lammel led his squad south through the craters. They advanced in a staggered line. German snipers fired at them. They returned fire and kept moving. It took 20 minutes to cover 400 yards. The terrain was that difficult. They reached the coastal road shortly after 8 a.m. The road was unpaved, just hard-packed dirt. Lammel studied the surface. Fresh tire tracks. Multiple tracks from heavy vehicles. Something large had been moved recently. The tracks came from the north, from the direction of Pointe du Hoc. They led south into an orchard. Lammel turned to Staff Sergeant Jack Kuhn, the acting platoon sergeant for 2nd Platoon. 24 years old, from Altoona, Pennsylvania. He'd trained with Lammel for 10 months. Lammel trusted him completely. Lammel told Kuhn to take half the squad and establish positions along the road. Create a roadblock. Stop any German vehicles or troops attempting to use the road. Kuhn and 6 Rangers took positions in the ditches on both sides of the road, establishing clear fields of fire in both directions. Any German vehicle attempting to pass would be caught in a crossfire. Lammel and 5 Rangers moved south along the sunken road between high hedgerows. The hedgerows in Normandy were 9 feet tall, thick tangles of earth, roots, and bushes that had been growing for centuries. Tanks couldn't push through them. Men could barely see over them. The sunken road ran between 2 hedgerows, creating a natural corridor. The tire tracks led down this road. Lammel and his men moved carefully. This was enemy territory. Germans could be anywhere. They advanced by leapfrogging. One man would move forward 20 yards while the others provided cover. Then the next man would move. They covered 200 yards in 10 minutes. The road opened into an orchard. Apple trees planted in neat rows. The trees were in bloom, white blossoms covering the branches. It would have been beautiful on any other day. Lammel held up his hand. His men stopped. He'd seen something. Ahead, under camouflaged netting stretched between trees, were artillery pieces. 5 of them. 5 155 millimeters guns. The missing battery from Pointe du Hoc. The guns were positioned in a line, spaced 20 yards apart, pointed north toward Utah Beach. The elevation was set. The range was set. Ammunition was stacked beside each gun, wooden crates marked with German stenciling containing shells, with powder charges in separate crates. The guns were ready to fire, but no crew was visible. Lammel scanned the orchard. Approximately 100 German soldiers were 300 yards away in an adjacent field, apparently assembled for a formation, probably the gun crews and security troops. They'd pulled back during the naval bombardment and hadn't yet returned to their guns. This was the moment. The guns were unguarded. Lammel could destroy them now. If he waited, the crews would return, and it would become a firefight. 6 Rangers against 100 Germans. Bad odds. Lammel whispered to his men. Kuhn would stay here with 4 Rangers and provide cover, watching those Germans. If they started approaching, the Rangers would open fire and give Lammel time to escape. Lammel was going in alone. Lammel moved forward in a crouch. He entered the orchard and approached the first gun. It was massive up close. The barrel was 12 feet long. The wheels were 5 feet tall. The gun sat on a wheeled carriage that allowed it to traverse and elevate. Lammel pulled out 2 thermite grenades. Thermite burned at 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt steel, hot enough to fuse gears and mechanisms permanently. He unscrewed the cap on the first grenade and placed it in the traverse mechanism of the first gun, which allowed the gun to swing left and right. He placed the second thermite grenade in the elevation mechanism of the second gun, which allowed the gun to raise and lower. He pulled the pins on both grenades. Thermite grenades didn't explode. They ignited silently and burned intensely. Within seconds, molten metal was flowing through the mechanisms. The gears were fusing together. The guns would never traverse or elevate again. They were permanently disabled. Lammel then took his Thompson submachine gun and wrapped it in his field jacket to muffle the sound. He used the butt like a hammer, smashing the optical sights on all 5 guns. Each gun had a telescopic sight for aiming, precision instruments that, once smashed, made the guns impossible to aim accurately. Even if the Germans repaired the traverse and elevation mechanisms, without sights, the guns were useless. Lammel had been in the battery for less than 10 minutes. He disabled 2 guns with thermite and smashed the sights on all 5. He moved back to where Kuhn was waiting. The German soldiers in the adjacent field hadn't moved. They hadn't heard anything. Lammel told Kuhn they needed more thermite grenades to completely destroy the remaining 3 guns. They moved back toward the coastal road where the rest of D Company was positioned. Lammel found other Rangers and obtained more thermite grenades. He and Kuhn returned to the orchard at approximately 8:45 a.m. The German gun crews were still absent. Lammel placed thermite grenades on the remaining 3 guns. He pulled the pins and stepped back. The grenades ignited. Molten metal flowed. As Lammel and Kuhn were withdrawing, they heard a massive explosion behind them. They turned and saw a fireball rising from the ammunition stacks. Rangers from E Company had arrived at the battery from a different direction. They'd thrown grenades into the ammunition crates. The crates exploded. Shells and powder charges detonated in a chain reaction. The explosion could be heard for miles. The 5 guns at Pointe du Hoc were destroyed. It was approximately 9 a.m. The primary mission was accomplished. Lammel sent 2 runners back to Rudder's command post to report mission accomplished. The runners reached Rudder at 9:15 a.m. Rudder was relieved. The guns that could have destroyed the invasion fleet would never fire. Back at the clifftop, Rudder had established his command post in a large bomb crater near the cliff edge. The crater provided protection from German fire and gave him a view of the battlefield. He could see his Rangers fighting across the clifftop. He could see the channel beyond the cliff. The radios were a problem. Most had gotten wet during the landing. Some worked intermittently. Others didn't work at all. Rudder needed to signal the main Ranger force offshore. The plan called for the 5th Ranger Battalion and the remaining companies of the 2nd Battalion to follow Force A up the cliffs if Rudder sent a success signal by 7 a.m. Force A had landed at 7:10 a.m., too late to send the signal on time. Without the signal, the 5th Rangers and Companies A and B of the 2nd Rangers would land at Omaha Beach instead of Pointe du Hoc. They'd have to fight west along the coast to reinforce Rudder. That would take hours, maybe days. By 9 a.m., Rudder had approximately 90 Rangers combat effective on the clifftop. 15 had been killed or seriously wounded during the climb. The rest were scattered across the position, engaging German forces. Ammunition was running low. Each Ranger had started with 80 rounds for his Garand. After 2 hours of fighting, most men were down to 20 or 30 rounds. The Germans were counterattacking. The first major counterattack came at 9:30 a.m. Approximately 200 German soldiers from a 914th Grenadier Regiment of the 352nd Infantry Division attacked from the south, coming through fields and hedgerows south of the coastal road. The Rangers held positions along the road and in craters across the clifftop. They had no artillery support. They had no air support. Cloud cover was too low for aircraft. They had rifles, grenades, and courage. The German attack came in waves. The first wave advanced to within 100 yards of Ranger positions before Ranger rifle fire stopped them. The Germans took cover and returned fire. Then the second wave advanced. The Rangers fired from cover, aiming carefully. Ammunition was too precious to waste. They made every shot count. The Germans fell back. By 11 a.m., the first counterattack was stopped, but it had cost the Rangers. Casualties now numbered 35 killed or seriously wounded. Each Ranger had fewer than 20 rounds remaining. The Germans attacked again at 1 p.m. This attack was better coordinated. Approximately 150 German soldiers advanced from west, using bomb craters for cover, moving from crater to crater the same way the Rangers had done. The fighting was close range, sometimes hand-to-hand when Rangers and Germans ended up in the same hole. The Rangers used their last grenades to break up the attack. By 2 p.m., the second counterattack was repulsed. Casualties now exceeded 50%. Less than 100 Rangers remained combat effective. Rudder was among the wounded. During the afternoon fighting, he was hit twice. A German sniper's bullet struck him in the left leg. Painful, but not disabling. He continued directing the defense from his command post. Later, a round from British naval gunfire fell short and exploded near his position. Shrapnel hit him in the right chest and arm. The wounds bled heavily. A medic bandaged them. Rudder refused evacuation. He remained in command. At 5 p.m., the Germans launched a third counterattack, this time from multiple directions, north, south, and west. They were trying to push the Rangers off the clifftop or force them over the cliff edge. The Rangers contracted their perimeter. They abandoned the most exposed positions and pulled back to craters closer to the cliff edge. They were now defending a perimeter less than 200 yards wide. They had nowhere left to retreat. If they lost these positions, they'd be pushed over the cliff. The attack continued until darkness at approximately 9 p.m. The Germans didn't break through. The Rangers held. As night fell on June 6th, Rudder counted his effective force. Of 225 Rangers who'd landed that morning, 90 were still able to fight. The rest were dead, wounded, or missing. Ammunition was almost exhausted. Food and water were gone. Medical supplies were depleted. The wounded lay in craters without morphine. The Rangers prepared for another German attack at dawn, knowing reinforcements might not arrive in time. During the night, German forces infiltrated the Ranger perimeter. Small firefights erupted in the darkness. Rangers used knives and entrenching tools when they ran out of ammunition. The sound of fighting continued through the night, occasional gunfire, grenades exploding, men shouting in English and German. At 3 a.m. on June 7th, Rudder received a message on one of the few working radios. Elements of the 5th Ranger Battalion had broken through German positions at Omaha Beach and were fighting west along the coast. They were approximately 3 miles from Pointe du Hoc. They might reach the position by noon if the Germans didn't stop them. Rudder passed the word to his Rangers. Hold until noon. Just hold until noon. Dawn came at 5:30 a.m. on June 7th. At 6 a.m., the Germans attacked again, the largest assault yet. Approximately 300 soldiers from the 352nd Infantry Division attacked from the south with mortar and artillery support. German shells exploded across the clifftop. The Rangers had no artillery to return fire. They had rifles with fewer than 10 rounds per man. The German attack pushed them back toward the cliff edge. By 8 a.m., the Ranger perimeter had contracted to less than 150 yards. German forces were within grenade-throwing range of Rudder's command post. At 9 a.m., the German attack paused. The Rangers were out of ammunition. Men were ready to throw rocks if the Germans came again. At 9:45 a.m., American naval artillery began falling on German positions south and west of Pointe du Hoc. The destroyer Satterlee had re-established radio communication with the Rangers. The ship's 5-inch guns fired on coordinates provided by Ranger forward observers. The shells screamed overhead and exploded in German positions. The German attack broke under the naval gunfire. German forces pulled back to regroup. At 11 a.m. on June 7th, lead elements of the 5th Ranger Battalion reached the coastal road south of Pointe du Hoc. 23 Rangers from the 5th had fought through 7 miles of German defenses from Omaha Beach. 23 fresh Rangers with full ammunition loads joined Rudder's force. It wasn't enough to break the German encirclement, but it was enough to hold longer. The fighting continued through June 7th. German counterattacks came every few hours. The Rangers held their contracted perimeter. Naval gunfire from Satterlee kept German forces from overrunning the position, but couldn't drive them away completely. On the morning of June 8th, American forces from the 116th Infantry Regiment and the 5th Ranger Battalion launched a coordinated attack from Omaha Beach toward Pointe du Hoc with tank support from the 743rd Tank Battalion. The tanks broke through German defensive positions. By noon on June 8th, 2 days after the initial landing, the American relief force reached Pointe du Hoc. The Rangers were finally relieved. The siege was over. Of the 225 Rangers who'd landed at Pointe du Hoc on June 6th, only 90 were still fit for duty when relief arrived. 77 Rangers were killed in action. 152 were wounded. 38 were listed as missing. The casualty rate exceeded 70%. Lieutenant Colonel James Rudder survived his wounds and was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. 13 other Rangers received the Distinguished Service Cross for heroism at Pointe du Hoc. First Sergeant Leonard Lammel received the award for his actions in locating and destroying the German gun battery. The Rangers had accomplished their mission. The 6 French 155mm guns at Pointe du Hoc never fired on the invasion beaches. Thousands of American soldiers landed safely on Utah and Omaha beaches because the Rangers climbed those cliffs and destroyed those guns. Today, Pointe du Hoc remains as an American battle monument. The bomb craters still cover the clifftop, unfilled. Destroyed German bunkers and gun pits stand as reminders. The cliff face still shows marks where ropes scraped the surface during the assault. In 1984, President Ronald Reagan stood at the cliff edge and addressed 62 surviving Rangers. These are the boys of Pointe du Hoc. These are the men who took the cliffs. These are the champions who helped free a continent. These are the heroes who helped end a war. The assault on Pointe du Hoc remains one of the most daring military operations in history. The Rangers did what everyone said couldn't be done because their training prepared them for the impossible, because their commander believed in them, and because retreat wasn't an option. The lesson of Pointe du Hoc isn't just about climbing cliffs or destroying guns. It's about doing what must be done regardless of the cost. The Rangers knew the mission was nearly impossible. They knew most wouldn't survive. They climbed anyway. That is courage. That is duty. That is what it means to be a Ranger.